Epilogue. Just a little boy with big dreams. The funeral of Mr. Devlin was a sad business, because although he was about 36 or 37, he didn't have any wife or kids. Maybe his chasing around Claudia was a kind of a chance in a million attempt for the jackpot. Anyway, he got the wrong numbers in every way. Unlucky bugger. Although I never liked him, really, I can't say that I wanted him dead, and certainly not in such a hideous way. Imagine being politically assassinated by such a non-entity as Old Harry. Actually, the only relative of Mr. D's who came to the funeral was his mother, who was about 80 or so, judging from the deepness of the wrinkles lining her face and the way she used one of those metallic frames for support. I went over to speak to her after the cremation, when she was waiting to receive the ashes from the undertaker. I told her who I was, and she said her Johnny had spoken about his job in the hotel many, many times, and had mentioned my name to her. She said he had told her that I was a hard-working little sort. She asked me, did I want to look at something that he'd written as a kid, and before I could nod my head, she showed me this red exercise book, one of the shiny ones with the little wavy lines all over the cover, and all kinds of weights and measurements on the back. But it was about 25 years old, and the paper was yellow, and the pencil writing very faded. It read, "The Road to the Top, 10 Rules for Success, by John Devlin, 12 3/4. Rule number 1, always try very hard at everything. Rule number 2, save your money in the post office book. Rule number 3, get a job and don't stay on in school. 4, work the hotel industry. 5, make lots of friends. 6, get married at 25. 7, don't eat too many sweets. 8, become an executive. 9, wear nice clothes. 10, listen to the boss." When I read this, I felt as if I knew more things Mr. Devlin When I read this, I felt as if I knew more about Mr. Devlin than I ever knew when he was alive, and I could see why his mother thought that the sun shone out of his arse, as they say. Just a little boy with big dreams, is what Nancy said, and probably just a harmless, lonely guy when everything was taken into account. Before we left, I said to his mum, he was a great boss to work for, and I think he knew he was going to get to the top. "I know, son, I know," she said, wiping a tear away as she relaxed with her left elbow on the Zimmer frame. After the funeral, Old Harry's trial was next on the agenda. It's like what moaners at bus stops are always saying to the other ones who don't want to hear because they've heard it all before, isn't it? Suddenly there's a whole string of them, one after the other. Of course, the horrible, gory details of the Old Harry, or as he was nicknamed, the Crazed Killer, evil old bastard story, caused a bit of a sensation and was reported in the Echo night after night. I've kept most of the cuttings in a private collection, which one day I will put together in a kind of booklet. The first article gives a clue as to the mental state of Old Harry and what he'd been up to in the years before killing Mr. Devlin. Accused letter hobby. A fortune spent on stamps. This dealt with the business of the anonymous letters that he'd sent out to selected individuals like myself and Mr. Devlin, and included letters to the following: Fidel Castro, Nelson Mandela, Ray Charles, Michael Jackson, Pope John Paul II, Vanessa Redgrave, Tony Blair, Neil Kinnock, the Bishop of Durham, Mr. Boris Yeltsin Gorbachev, Jesse Jackson, Rajiv Gandhi, Margaret Thatcher, Cilla Black, Bruce Forsyth, Ken Dodd, Catherine Cookson, Ben Johnson, Colonel Gaddafi, the Dalai Lama, Linford Christie, Emperor Hirohito, Jane Fonda, Gaza, Paul Daniels, Lenny Henry, Li Peng, Yves Saint Laurent, etc. I suppose all of these people seemed like a threat to him. Turns out he had been writing to them for years. Stupidly, he actually kept copies of most of them. The mad old bastard claimed that General Nasser of Egypt was seriously concerned with the letters he'd been sent, as the writer had claimed intimate knowledge of that country's from his wartime experience. The General's headquarters. Uniform too large. Awards himself VC. Turns out he wasn't actually in the army. He had a congenital problem with flat feet. Just liked to talk. His anecdotes about his army days were all totally imaginary, and I suppose we lost a talent there when the old bastard was put inside. Mind you, he'll find plenty of people there to amuse with his little stories. Conversation lacked charm. Killer's obscene suggestions. Compromising situation. This was mainly Nancy's evidence, and when she turned up in court to give her evidence, you could hear the crowd gasp with wonder at her. And that's not just my opinion, because the Echo mentioned the audible murmur when she first appeared. She told the story of the first time she met old Harry, and how he tried to get her to do things. When she was asked what these things were, she refused to answer, because she said they were disgusting. The judge asked her to whisper her reply, which she did. Mind you, everybody could hear what she said, and you should have heard the hubbub after Nancy finished the sentence. She went on to talk about how he was discovered with his clothes in some kind of disarray in the flyhole part, and how he had to leave his job at the Eagle. As far as the case was concerned, the sense of old Harry's grievance and frustration, which had led to the murder, began to emerge after Nancy's evidence. Obviously, it was losing his job that tipped the balance. But then again, he might have stayed at the hotel and decided to poison all the guests instead, or planned to rape and murder, just say 2 or 3 of them. So I might have actually saved lives, if you look at it that way. Nephew's news network. He gave me all the gossip, says former manager. I couldn't believe my eyes when who should turn up to give evidence at the trial, but just call me Alan Butterthwaite, old Harry's nephew. Mr. Butter was out of the hospital at the time of the trial, but had become a born-again Christian, and was therefore bound to tell the truth since he was on oath. Nightman testifies. Innocent victim describes hideous ordeal. This was my stuff. I have a bit of a confession to make. I did not fully explain my own role in the dismissal of Mr. Devlin and old Harry. Mind you, and I'm telling the truth here, I wasn't asked for any account of it because no one knew about it. I told the court about how old Harry was always hanging around, and how he had met Nancy on the fateful night, and how I was the one who was involved in the discovery. But the main part of my evidence was to do with the letters I had been receiving. I read them all out in court, and obviously people were disgusted because once or twice I heard people say shame, and at other times hiss aloud at what they had heard. When I was cross-examined by the defence bloke, he asked me if I had written them myself to frame old Harry. I got a huge laugh when I told him that old Harry had actually admitted to writing them himself. Sorry, I forgot, said the bloody lawyer. Can you believe that? A whiter Britain. Political extremist speaks in defence. The leader of the White Light movement on Merseyside was called to give evidence in old Harry's behalf. He did not support extreme violence as a measure, although he said persuasion was a valuable tool in their general campaign. When he was asked what persuasion might mean, he said, "How long's a piece of string?" referring, I thought, at first, to the process of lynching, which was always a favourite with those kinds of groups. My memory will live after me. Convicted killer warns country. This was all about what old Harry had said before he was sentenced. He warned the British people of the danger of racial dilution and impurity, and urged the judge to accept that his crime was for the good of Britain. The jury didn't really have a very difficult job in the circumstances, and of course he was found guilty. Then the judge did not accept his statement and sentenced him to 25 years in a secure mental hospital under strict surveillance. This meant he would be 98 before he was let loose on the world again, provided he served the full term. I was hoping he would, because even at 98 I wouldn't trust him. The wedding of myself to Nancy took place in Brougham Terrace Registry Office, sometimes called St. Braugham's, one Saturday in late August. Leroy was my best man, and Claudia was maid of honour. Nancy wore a beautiful white dress, which I insisted on, even though she said something the colour of her heart and passion was what was required. A deep blood red, for example. But I said that white was the colour of simplicity, and that won the day. The food was provided by an outside firm called Jellyman's Classic Caterers, and consisted of wonderful plates of food from all over the world in a multicultural buffet. My particular favourite was the couscous macaroon à la Paris, which had chunks of meat the size of potatoes in it, as well as a sloppy, greasy, gorgeous sauce. Nancy loved the stir-fried king prawns in chili tomato sauce. Jellyman had actually hired a Chinese cook to do this and a number of other wild things. To add to the exotic quality, and because I was forced to invite my closest living relative, the wedding breakfast found itself with a surfeit of steak and kidney pies a la Fazzacurly. Nevertheless, these came in handy after Jellyman's Cabaret and Jeff and John Smith's stand-up comedy act. John Smith has given up being a merchant banker to become partner to Jeff's alternative comedy act. Most of the jokes were about small backstreet hotels like the Eagle and dreadful monstrosities like Old Harry, so the jokes were what you could call typical. Nancy is now pregnant with what looks like triplets, and Claudia and I are sharing the job of Eagle Hotel manager after a surprise letter from the main office in Chester. We were told that our good work had been noticed and that we should have an opportunity to provide some stability to the place by taking on some responsibility. It's still a lonely kind of place, with the same old customers and taxi drivers and B-movie monsters and all the kinds of creeps and cheats and liars. But now it's friendly, and the place runs like velvet clockwork, as Leroy had said to me in one of his poetic moods. I have to say, I love my work. But the other day I got a funny letter with a drawing of a cat breathing fire, in which you could make out swastikas and Union Jacks and smoking guns. Right in the middle of the design, it said, "Just wait, shithouse, you're next."